If you don't know me, I'm Nate. I'm part of the pastoral team here at Christ Church. And first of all, the Apostle Peter there that Dave just read, the Apostle Peter just got done telling us multiple times, you are a holy priesthood. What on earth does that mean? For that, we're going to have to go way back, all the way back to like 1400 BC. So just like Uruguay has how many departments? Does anyone know? 19. Just like Uruguay has 19 departments, in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel had 12 departments or tribes. And one of those tribes was a priesthood. So their vocation was the ministry. And the other 11 were like farmers and merchants and artisans, that kind of thing. Now, the basic job or ministry of an Israelite priest was to connect God with the people and the people with God. They were like a bridge to help make things right between the imperfect people and the perfect God. In other words, they were like mediators or representatives or ambassadors from God to people to reconcile the two so they can have a relationship. That's God's great joy. So part of their ministry was to offer sacrifices of worship. And it was also to declare the praises of the one who brought them from the darkness of slavery to the light of freedom and salvation. And they weren't just supposed to declare those praises to God and to the fellow Israelites, but to the other nations, like we heard in the psalm at the very beginning of the service. And finally, they were supposed to reflect who God is with all of their being, specifically his holiness. Holiness means to be set apart, to stand out, to be different. So the idea was not just to keep the sacred things in the sacred spaces, but to take the sacred things out into the secular spaces. Not just with words, but with how they lived and who they were. So as representatives of God, they were supposed to give people a taste of what the one they represent is like. And the psalmist said, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." But then God does something countercultural and revolutionary. He then tells the entire nation of Israel, just like you guys have a priesthood to connect you with God, now you as an entire nation are to be a priesthood to the other nations. You're supposed to be a kingdom full of priests, a holy, set apart, different like God kind of nation. See, the Israelites had experienced this reconnection with God. And now it was their job, their ministry, whether they were a farmer, a merchant, or a priest, to be connecting people of other nations to God. To be worshiping and serving, to be declaring him to others, and to be reflecting who he is with all of who they were. So as representatives of God, they were supposed to be giving people a taste of what the one they represent is like. The psalmist says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." But if you know the story of the Old Testament, you know that the Israelites, like all humans, were not great at representing and reflecting God's holiness. Their hypocrisy, their deceit, their envy and slander and just overall evil caused a natural line of separation between them and the perfect God. So these priests would have to continually intercede with these sacrifices for sins, for themselves and for the people. This maintained the connection between God and them. And this system was like to tie them over as the people waited for God's ultimate solution for this disconnection problem. When Jesus, God putting on human flesh, came, he was the only human who perfectly represented God and reflected his holiness perfectly. In fact, the Bible said he's actually the exact representation of God's very being. So he was able to be two important things. He was able to become the ultimate, final, only priest by not only offering sacrifices, but becoming the ultimate, final, once for all sacrifice for sin. Because we'd never be good enough to reconcile ourselves to God, but Jesus was. See, God put on human skin so that he could put on human sin on the cross. That's what Peter told us. He says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross. See, the power of sin was crucified along with Jesus. But Jesus conquered death itself and came back to life. But the power of sin did not. It stayed dead. So since he is alive, since he lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he's able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So he is the only mediator necessary between God and people. We have direct access to God through Jesus. And he's appealing to all people, be reconciled to God through faith in me. And yet, he invites all of us to be his ambassadors, as though he was making his appeal through us. He gives all of us what he calls the ministry of reconciliation. So now today in the church, we have certain people who make it their vocation to connect people with God, the people that we would consider in ministry, right? The pastors and the missionaries. And yet, Peter here in the New Testament is saying to all of God's people, to you are a priesthood. So today we're concluding this series called the Church Culture Revolution with this final characteristic of an emotionally healthy church, with this revolutionary culture. And the title today is Everyone in Full-Time Ministry. Everyone in full-time ministry. That's likely to sound absurd to you because for most of us, there are these very clear lines. There's two very important lines of distinction. There's the clergy and the congregation, or the pastors and the attenders. And then there's the line between secular and sacred, like who we are outside the church and who we are inside the church. Now, distinctions can be helpful, so we're not trying to erase them. But what we want to do today is to allow God's word to properly blur these two lines of separation. This would be revolutionary for a church culture, for everyone to see themselves as in ministry and in full time. Because there are three natural assumptions from a typical church culture that probably affect how we hear a phrase like that. Without a doubt, at first glance at that title, we would say, well, ministry is for ministers, right? I mean, it's in the name. Yes, but there's more. Certainly, pastors and teachers are important. I hope so. But they're not the whole body. They're one part of the body. And the body doesn't go very far with just one part. But God said he has given pastors and teachers to do the work of the ministry, right? Actually, in Ephesians 4, it says he's given pastors and teachers to equip his people for the work of ministry or service, so that the body of Christ may be built up. Now, the word ministry means to serve. And in our revolutionary church culture, we don't want it to be like employees and clients or performers and spectators. We want it to be all full-time Christians serving together and serving each other, with all the parts working together. We can actually go somewhere. We can build this thing up. Remember, Peter said, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices or worship acceptable to God through Christ. So in the Bible, the word serve is very closely associated with worship. In fact, in Hebrew and Greek, the word that they use for serve is the same as worship. So that's part of what it means to be part of a priesthood, to serve and worship. And offering spiritual sacrifices is like taking something that's valuable to you, like your time or your gifts or your other resources, and offering them to him for his purposes. That's what God says is worship. And that's what makes him smile. And here at Christ Church, everybody participates. So, if ministry is serving and worshiping, then that's for all of us, not just the ministers, everyone in ministry. But then comes our second natural assumption. Serving and worship is for church, right? Well, yes, but there's more. So certainly serving and worshiping in the church is important. We may initially think of worship as music or singing, but that's just one part of what it means to worship. And even serving as part of the music team is one of many ways to serve. So maybe you've found a way to use your gifts here to manage the finances or to be a storyteller with the kids, facilitate a small group, or manage the PowerPoint. That's awesome. It's great because it helps us to see that we are all serving together and serving each other. But this serving and worshiping in the church is still just only one part of the whole. God tells us that our true service of worship that he enjoys the most is actually when we offer ourselves to live for him, not on Sundays at church, but Monday through Saturday outside the church. So if serving and worship is living for God, then that's for all the time, not just at church. Everyone is in full-time ministry. We want full-time Christians. Because remember, Peter said, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. So like the Israelites, if you've experienced this reconnection with God, it's now your ministry, whether you're a plumber or a student or a pastor, to be connecting people of all nations with God. Now, you may have heard me say this before, but I had a professor in college who would always tell us a story about his father, who was a piano tuner. So my professor had been a missionary in Central Africa for decades, but he always had this deep respect and almost an envy of the ministry of his father, who was a simple piano tuner. Because he would say his father would go into people's homes to tune their pianos, and he would end up having extraordinary conversations with people, often about Jesus, and sometimes people would even come to faith. See, he was invited right into their home. These same people would probably never invite someone named pastor into their home. So whatever you do, you can actually go where pastors and missionaries can't. So the final assumption then is, well, living for God outside the church is basically sharing my faith, right? Yes, but there's more. If you've experienced this reconciliation, going from darkness to light, it's reasonable to declare that to the people around you when you have the opportunity. But that's only part of our ministry. Living for God, which is worshiping and serving, which is our ministry, is more than just speaking God-like things. It's more than doing God-like things. It's actually being like God in all that we are, which is only possible when we are being with him. So like God said to the priesthood and then to the entire nation of Israel, Peter repeats to us. Just like he who called you is holy, be holy, set apart, different, sacred in all you do. So living for God, serving in worship, ministry, is reflecting who God is in all that we are, not just sharing our faith. As representatives of God, we're supposed to be giving people a taste of what the one we represent is like. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Unfortunately, like the Israelites, we're all imperfect. And while we're all in process, some Christians have unfortunately left a bad taste in people's mouths. So now is your time. If you have a red box on the end of your row, it's just a sour candy. Don't be afraid. So you're welcome to take one out, pop it in your mouth, and pass it down to your neighbor. You don't have to if you don't want to. But this is just to connect another sense with what we're saying today. So when his representatives taste bad, people taste and see that the Lord is bad. Now, in Uruguay, Skittles are relatively new arrivals from the U.S., so it's possible that you haven't tried one yet. So what if I told you, here, try one of these TNT candies. It's kind of like a Skittle. You'd be like, ugh, if this is what a Skittle is like, no, thank you. Now, there is a sour version of Skittles, but it's not the original. What if Christians tasted more like the original that we represent? If you poll people who aren't fans of the church, and they have, you won't be surprised with some of the common words that they associate with it from their experience. Hypocrisy, deceit, greed, unkind words, just overall malice, right? Now, without getting into all the reasons and if it's always justified or not, the reality is that this is consistently a major factor for people not wanting to be a part of this. Some negative experience with the church or Christians. And while we can hope that people can differentiate some behavior from some humans and the potential truth of the message of Jesus, in reality, it's exactly as Jesus predicted. How we live and how we love is directly tied to people connecting if we're his followers or not, and if he is good to follow or not. So what do you know? The very first verse that Dave read from 1 Peter chapter 2 says, since you're part of this priesthood of representatives, be more like him by ridding yourselves of all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. And down in verse 12, he says, live such good lives among the unbelievers, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So kind of the big conclusion for today is all of us, all the time, in all that we are, let's be like Jesus. To be different. All of us, all the time, in all that we are, being like Jesus. This is living for God. This is worship. This is our ministry. But we can only be transformed into this by being with him. So this is not on our strength. But here are some ways that we can make an effort. In the places we already naturally and normally go, we can stand out by working hard and with excellence, as though we're working for the Lord. With a good attitude, even when it makes no sense to have a good attitude. The Bible actually calls this worship. In fact, in Hebrew and Greek, the same word for worship is the word for work. So our work can be our worship. And we can stand out by living with integrity when it's easier not to, and by showing respect when it is not deserved. Man, this is hard. Because Peter, throughout this chapter, goes on to talk about respecting governing authorities, even if they're terrible, and our bosses, even if they're terrible, and just people in general who might falsely accuse you or insult you or treat you poorly for doing the right thing and being different in this way. For me, this is a super hard calling because it's not fair. We inwardly feel like the people that do the right thing should be the ones that get rewarded. But most often, I would say, we see those people punished and the wrongdoers get off free as a bird. But as good as innocent as we might feel we are, Peter reminds us in the end of this chapter. He reminds us that Jesus was perfectly good, and he was falsely accused. He was insulted, and yet he stood out. He was different by not retaliating. He entrusted himself and justice in the hands of the one who judges justly. So being like Jesus is our worship and our ministry, right? So being like him in this radical endurance and faithfulness is worship to God. People may not agree with you, but you never know. They may see your good deeds and glorify God. So finally, we can stand out by going above and beyond where we normally go and what we naturally do. Let's be bold and creative in thinking of ways to make our world more like his kingdom. Think of some problem that you'd like to personally put a dent into. Maybe it's mistreatment of children. Maybe it's your neighbor's food insecurity. Maybe it's your relative's challenge with depression or loneliness. Do for one what you wish you could do for 1,000,000. Our people here in this community are great at this. So one small example is you can join us in Project Generosity. We visit people in hospitals. We provide food for people. We show God's love in a variety of ways. But it doesn't have to be a program here. It can be personal on your own. This is the church culture revolution. Imagine what could happen if everyone saw themselves as in ministry all the time. So what about you? Have you tasted and seen that the Lord is good? Have you entrusted yourself to be healed by his wounds? Have you crossed from darkness to light? If not, you're invited to right now. If so, how could your life look differently if you recognize that you are in full-time ministry as we've defined it today? So as the band comes up, I just want to take some time to think. That's always super helpful for me. Let's just reflect and think. What is something that excites you? What is some wrong that you want to try to alleviate? What opportunities could you see this week to live this gift of life, to worship the one that gave it to us?